everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. My name is Madison, and I'm a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma, joined by some of our community members and two amazing guests. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. Tonight, we're talking about local. And so everyone could give a brief introduction and then say 1 to 3 words that they associate with local. And Raven, you can go ahead and get us started off.
Alrighty, hi everyone. My name is Raven Owens. I'm 16 years old and I'm a sophomore from Edmond, Oklahoma. The first thing that comes to mind when I think of local is actually Twitter, because I know local is a word they like to use a lot about like people who like are in like mainstream pop things. And then parks, actually, probably the next word when I think so many local parks. And then I think Twitter and parks would be my first words that come to mind when I think of local, actually.
Can I go ahead?
For sure.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Nameeshka, and I go to a private school here in India, Mumbai. And two things. One thing that comes in my mind when I think about local is actually beautiful, because the stuff that we get here that are like made from Indian craftsmen are really, really pretty. So probably beautiful and cheap, because it's really cheap.
Sarah, you're up.
Swell. My name is Sarah Rose. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. I am 26 years old. I work for a company that builds affordable housing across the country. So one of the things I think of when I think of local is geography, because I am an urban studies nerd and think about geography a lot. And the other one is unions. They often refer to themselves as like by their sector, so plumbers or service workers, etc., and then their local number. So the sort of like community or mutual aid pods, sort of local organizing.
Oh, I guess I'm next. Hi, I'm Amy, Amy Nederlander. I live in New York, and I'm a guest tonight. 1 to 3 words regarding local. One is community, and because local community, and I love knowing my neighbors, and local businesses, which we love to support, and interesting. I love where I live, and the communities that I choose to be involved with locally, I find to be fascinating. You know, going to get milk could be interesting.
I think of newspapers, which have been really kind of ravaged over the past decade or so. And I think of systems. I think we talk a lot about like national issues and very often too abstract of terms, but it's like the local systems that affect our lives often the most.
Yeah, Gary, my word association really piggybacks off of that. It's important, but unglamorous for the same reasons that you said. Like, we pay so much attention to national politics, I think, because it's easy. There's a lot of drama that goes on with it, and it can honestly be entertaining, which is probably a bad sign. But local politics is really what affects the most of day-to-day issues. But the truth is that it's not very glamorous. So it's hard to pay attention to. But I guess since Ashley's not here, right? Okay. So if Ashley comes, maybe we can.
Yeah, we can bounce back.
Yeah. But now we can get started for the actual conversation. So this is pretty free flowing. Anyone who wants to can pose a question or provocation about local, and then we can just all start talking about it. So does anyone have a question they want to pose? Amy?
Yeah, I really had a response to you saying local is unglamorous. As we started to talk about, I'm from Detroit originally. I live in New York. I have a nonprofit, a youth leadership and career development organization in Detroit. And so living in New York City, there's a lot of local advocacy, a lot of local, because you were talking about unglamorous in terms of politically, I believe, right? Is that what you meant in terms of unglamorous? And so there's living in New York, there's a lot of local advocacy, but working and being from Detroit and local is, it's wildly glamorous to be involved and getting to be more and more glamorous and more important. And so it was interesting. And maybe that's because so much change is going on there. So much change has had to go on there. The change started probably about 10 years ago. And where important change, the honest conversation, the social justice movement, and really addressing inequities on so many different levels. And it's like the world and the country has come together. And because Detroit started this conversation many years ago, they're really had been elevated to the top of that conversation in many ways. And I don't know, but it's the kids that I work with are really seeing how Detroit's become and Michigan has become involved in what's going on in DC and involved at the forefront in the response to COVID and to the peaceful protests. And they keep saying we're so proud, and they're really proud, and they're starting to really pay attention to the local leaders and how they have to vote locally to get their representatives in office, so that those representatives can make the policy to make all these things, to formalize all of these things that are happening. So anyway, I just had a response because of that.
Yeah, I thank you so much for calling that out. I think that I'm probably a little bit biased, or I don't know, like I probably have, it's important to recognize that local doesn't have the same connotation depending on where you're at. So like I'm in the middle of rural Oklahoma right now. So when I think local, I think unglamorous. Like there's nothing that really is going on right now that's going to affect anything on a national scale. And people just don't really pay attention to it, except for, I guess, like crimes that happen every once in a while. And so I think that that's a really good point for you to call out and for me to recognize. So, yeah.
So actually, to build off that really quickly, I am no longer, but about 20 minutes ago was in Ferguson, Missouri, because I was dropping something off for a friend. And that is, I think, one example of something that was local making the leap into something that is not local. So the Ferguson uprising in 2014, yes, 2014, was an incredibly local issue. It was the local police, and it was the local tickets and fines about how you drive. And then, but because there was so much power locally, it got turned into this massive national movement. I wouldn't say it's glamorous. I don't think anyone who came through that focused on the glamour as much as they focused on the localized pain.
And that localized pain really representing problems that are far too common across our country and the world, right? So, yeah. I think one thing that's important about local is that sometimes you feel like you're alone. And then when you start communicating, you realize, wait a minute, I'm not alone. And yeah, I don't know, I'm just riffing.
Nameeshka, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to add anything?
Yes. So to give like another classic example for what Amy said, in India, do you mind if I give an Indian example?
Of course.
Okay. So like currently in India, we're having farmer protests, and the farmer protests actually originated from only 2-3 states in India. And it was not supposed to be this whole massive movement of farmers coming together and kind of protesting against the government. But because these issues, the farmer laws, became so heart touching for like all the farmers across the country. This kind of formulated to become like a national movement, which was traditionally and planned not to be what is known as a revolution in India.
That's so interesting. Why do you think that it evolved into something much bigger than what maybe was initially planned?
So I think this is a completely personal opinion. Why I feel the farmer laws kind of formulated to being a national movement is because of political reasons, emotional reasons, and kind of the socio-economic situation India is in right now. We're not stable. Saying it out loud, we are currently not stable politically, economically, and socially. We have issues that we need to tackle, but no one's ready to stand up and say, okay, fine, let's do this, let's do that. So the public kind of has to latch on to what seems dramatic and what seems important. And the media is basically running for the public, and they kind of propagated it. They made a mountain out of a molehill, and they kept going on and on and on about it. And everyone was like, oh my God, this is big. And then there were protests and another protest and meetings with the government. Basically, everything's round and round and going nowhere. Nobody is ready to stand up and say, let's solve this. They're just discussing about the problem. No one cares about the solution. That's what's annoying about my country. Nobody cares about the solution. The moment a solution is put up, everything dies down. It's only about the problem. And I think that's a big issue.
Well, I bet there's a lot of money to be made as a media organization
Exactly.
and not
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that I don't think that just talking about problems is something unique to India as well. I know I see that happen in the US, especially politicians being able to talk about problems all day long, but when it comes to solutions, especially when they're in office, not sure how often those actually happen.
Hey, Ashley, do you want to introduce yourself? And if you want, you can do a word association.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Ashley. I am 17 from Vancouver, Washington. Something really quickly in response to, I think, what we were just talking about. I think there's just unique dynamic because I feel like locally you get to know the problems a lot better when you're in the community and you're actually experiencing it, and you see a lot of the small details and the things that are going wrong. But in order to actually enact solutions, a lot of times you need resources that, I don't know, yes, there are a lot of resources in local communities, but a lot of times it is helpful to have external resources. And so the challenge becomes how do you align the two? If people are coming, if people are bringing in resources from outside, how do you communicate what the problem is in a way that allows things to be allocated to where they need to be? But yes, word association wise, I think of knowledge and impact, because I feel like locally a lot of, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of knowledge in your immediate community on what is going right and what is going wrong. And a lot of times the best way to make impact is to start with the people around you.
Go for it. You can just unmute whenever you have something to say.
Okay, I'm sorry. Ashley, I have a question for your response to the question. I wanted to know what, according to you, can locals do to kind of help with the solution building, and what can we constitutionally provide to the local community to kind of enhance the conversation about solution building? Do I make sense?
Yeah. Is your question, okay, what can... Yeah, I think that's a great question. I guess like what I think about I mean, I guess what I think about is like, I don't know. I feel like locally you would need someone to like facilitate productive conversations about solutions. Um I guess like it's helpful to have someone who is like, I don't know, like guiding people towards a common goal, and I feel like that is the role of the facilitator. Like they are a process guide. I mean, I don't know. I guess like something that I like kind of struggle with, or like something that isn't like sitting right with me is like, what is the balance between like, you know, like, are we giving things to local communities and telling communities how to come up with solutions and solve their problems, or like, are we like empowering and trusting local communities to do it themselves?
Madison, do you want to talk a little bit about like subsidiarity?
Yeah, so subsidiarity is actually, I think it derives from Catholicism, right, Gary? It's basically the idea that local communities and states should have the authority to kind of like create their own governance and their own laws, which could, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Gary. That's basically what it is. Like that we should be trusting smaller bodies or smaller communities and groups of people to be making decisions that are going to impact them the most.
Yeah. Like basically the people that should take most ownership over like make the most decisions that affect the well-being of a particular sphere of influence should be the ones that are closest to the action, right? So like the Pope should not be micromanaging people in some you know, some smaller part of the Catholic world, right? And it extends beyond, right, Catholicism. It's become like just like a political philosophy concept as well. Something that I think just makes a lot of sense, even within an organization. You have a bunch of like sub organizations within an organization that really should have a great deal of autonomy, although like share a kind of high level, long-term vision.
You're touching on something that is a real hot button in our country right now politically. So I'm trying to avoid taking that into that direction, but I'd like to just acknowledge that we've seen a real struggle between local and federal, let's say state, local, and federal, who should control what, and yeah, where those lines are drawn. So it's a debate that continues domestically for us and across the world.
And I think part of Ashley's point, you can take this to sort of what is the most local, state, or federal, state, city, and then you can take it to who is closer to the problem. So folks who received a whole bunch of parking tickets or speeding tickets in Ferguson Florissant knew that that was the problem, and they knew what could be done about that. They know what can be done about policing because they are physically so close to police officers constantly. So I think part of it is that, but like I live in Missouri, the state government of Missouri does not represent St. Louis City and maybe what needs to change and augment in St. Louis City to help the most residents. Like, I don't even know that because I'm not from here. Like folks who've lived here and live in like Ferguson, for example, are much closer to what the solutions look like. And another, like there's tons of versions of this, like mutual aid groups or credit unions, sort of people who said, we need access to money, but the banks won't give us access to money. Maybe we can all raise money amongst ourselves and give ourselves access to money. Or And I mean, to Ashley, to sort of answer one of the questions earlier, Medicaid, Medicare was originally a local plan. Access to Wi-Fi provided by the city government was originally a local plan. A lot of these national ideas started as things that were tried out in cities and states and now can be sort of mass implemented.
Great points. Yeah, you don't want like the widest sphere to be your experimental bed. You want to try it out on a local level, which is something I really admire about what Andrew Yang is trying to do, or is doing. He's really helping like cities like Stockton and I think some in Virginia and other places run UBI pilots, because it's hard to advocate for something that hasn't been tried out on a smaller scale.
Raven, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think what Gary and Sarah saying are a really great idea to, start a sort of centralize new ways of doing locally, because I feel like that's a great way to prove to maybe, well, not prove, but yeah, prove to like skeptics about maybe what you're implementing, if they see that it can actually like be successful in a small setting, and then you start to grow it and grow it and grow it. Because I see a lot of times with people who are skeptical about things are skeptical about, because we're taking them straight to like the national and federal field, and they're like, we don't even know if this will work. We don't even know if this will work in my city, in my county, in my state. How do we know if it's going to work nationally? So I think for a lot of people, it'd be great if we could just see some of these bigger ideas implemented in smaller settings.
Can I go ahead?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so I completely agree with what like everyone's saying, but I just have one concern. How are you going to unify the laws that is made in one state to another state? Like, we have a country, we can't have different laws in different states. I think the problem with having localized government is not the fact, I'm so sorry, is not the fact that the locals might not be able to handle the situation, because they would. It's local. The problem is right in front of them. The solution they will figure out, because they're so close to uh, this, the issue. But the only thing is, sometimes you really need the federal, or the one government that is centralized, that is making uniform laws and rules for the whole country, because then it's just like one state is an own country. You still need a unifying factor, right? And the thing about trying solutions in a localized manner, like Medicare for all and everything, um, actually demographics change when you work with a bigger crowd. When you have a solution that is put for a state or a city, the parameters are different. But when you do the same solution without changing anything to a whole country, the parameters are very different. And if you succeed in, say, a state, or a city or a province, you cannot guarantee the same success in a whole country. And I think that is, um, so having solution based, say, in a state or a city or a province, does not kind of guarantee that the same solution will work for everyone.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a really great point, and something that I thought about as well is like, if each state or city is doing what works best for them, like what is the role of the nation then? Like how are we still, like what are we still unified by? And I think that it begs an important question, and I think I'm gonna reference something that I've referenced before. Gary knows the Rethink Humanity report, which is just an amazing book about all the transformations that are going to happen over the next 10 years. And to summarize one of the key points, they basically talk about how we're moving from the age of extraction, so the age of like taking like fossil fuels and things from the environment, and actually moving into the age of creation, to where we can actually create all of our food and like sustainable energy. And because of that, local areas will be very self-sustaining, and geography will no longer be an advantage or disadvantage. So no matter where you are, you'll be able to have the same access to food or just like the basic necessities of life. And so I think that really, it might be uncomfortable to think about drastically changing the role between the federal government and like what role that plays in our lives. But I think that with the changes in technology and that are going to happen within society, it's almost necessary. Like we can't have the same sort of organizing systems that worked, decades ago and expect to implement them here and it to work as effectively or even at all. So I think that it really begs the question, like, how does our relationship with the federal government change over time? And I don't know, there's a lot of different ideas about what role they play once people become, like, local areas become more independent. That's definitely something I'd like to explore more as well.
So good. I'm already learning so much about the almost unresolvable like tension between local and national. I was reading actually about how, I'm curious if you think this was a big win for India, Nameeshka, but the Digital India, do you know what that is? Like the unified ID for everyone. What are your thoughts on that? That has been touted as a big success.
Yes.
Do you agree?
So if I remember correctly, this was I think 5 years back, if I'm not wrong. But national ID numbers, we call that Aadhaar cards over here, and it is a great stuff. I mean, it's a revolution. It's very good. It kind of unifies the whole country. You don't need a driver's license, passport, all of those identification. You just need your Aadhaar card, and you're sought in almost all government offices. Secondly, like government offices in India, if you have to do something, if you have to get anything done in a government office, don't expect it to happen at least 6 months before you need it. So yeah, because stuff are slow and very slow here. So yeah, we believe in taking stuff slowly and peacefully, kind of work with our relationship with the government agency. So yeah, coming back to my point, the Aadhaar cards were actually not a idea that was supposed to be same thing. It was not an idea that was supposed to be put for the whole country. It was started by, if I remember correctly, the Uttar Pradesh government. I do not remember, I apologize. But again, it worked for them. They said this is a good idea because you poor people actually do not have the technological and the monetary resources to actually go file for a passport or any other identification or a PAN card number or something. So an Aadhaar card is actually free. It costs, I think, very nominal, 5 rupees or sorts, of sorts, and it kind of made documentation very easy. Also, another feature of the Aadhaar card is if your child gets lost, you can just track their Aadhaar card number, and you can kind of track where the child is currently, and then you can, do the needful. But all of this security and then monetary benefits. But the thing is, Aadhaar card costed a lot for our government, and to be honest, at that point in time, in my opinion, we weren't ready for that much money on identification. We had more pressing problems that had to be solved, and yeah.
Cool. Thanks for that. Anyone have another question or provocation they want to pose?
I do actually. So this is not about politics, but this is about local businesses. Why did we start actually supporting local businesses in the pandemic, and why do we discourage before the pandemic? Why was the before pandemic world so unstable for local businesses to work.
I personally think that the need to support, the problem of the lack of support for local businesses was elevated by the pandemic. It's not that it was a conscious thing not to support local businesses, but I think that, you know, shopping is a convenience thing. And you go to the big markets, and the big markets are usually chains and, you know, or what have you. And so I don't know. I think that, yeah, whoops. Did I lose you guys? Sorry about that. A call came through. Yeah, I think that it just wasn't front of mind. The way that it was caused to be front of mind from the pandemic was one of the reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's just become like evident, like, you know, Nike's probably not struggling much. If you, I mean, like maybe they're like, for example, like a brand like Nike, maybe they have less sales, but it's not like they're going to be threatened to close down. And so like all these small businesses, if they're threatening closing, and like, I guess like it just highlights a bigger theme of like, we only really start paying attention to issues when they're like almost too far gone, or like when they're like really, really bad. I can see that theme play out with like even things like climate change. Like, I think it's we don't, yeah, it's just like we can only really see the urgency of problems when it's too late, it seems to be.
Also, this brings it full circle back, Madison, to what you were saying about the book that you spoke of, about how local communities are going to be much more self-sustaining. So I didn't even think of it that way, but yeah.
Definitely to touch on what, oh, I'm sorry. And to touch on what Madison said, I feel like and kind of what Amy said, I feel like for a lot of people, it just wasn't at the forefront of our mind. I feel, especially, I know I can speak for myself when I say when the pandemic hit and I saw, you know, how many people were at risk of eviction, or how many people were at risk of losing their jobs. That's when I would really turn to my own community. I was like, I haven't supported any of these businesses. I know a lot of them are struggling because of this pandemic. I don't want someone to possibly like lose their livelihood, or like their house, or, you know, probably maybe even like how they're going to eat because of a pandemic. And I want to do whatever I can to support them. And I especially hope in a kind of post-pandemic world, whatever that'll look like, I hope that we continue this, because I feel like a lot of times when things are at the forefront, you know, it's just easy when things are right there to be like, oh yeah, I'll go support them. But when we start getting in a post-pandemic world, and I feel like it's going to go to a lot of people's in the back of their mind, they're kind of slowly forget. And I hope that like us as a like community, a nation, that we don't forget about these local businesses, because just because like the pandemic might have gone away or whatever doesn't mean these local businesses need to stop having support from their own communities.
So there's a couple studies about, zoning laws I have a lot of opinions on, but that's not this. There's a couple studies that are done. So part of the reason that I think about local businesses a lot is because there are studies about how long it takes for a dollar to leave a community, particularly like poor communities, disinvested communities, rural communities, like city communities, etc. And if you spend $1 at Walmart, like that's it. That's not, they're maybe giving jobs to local folks, but mostly it's going internationally. Versus if you spend $1 at your local bookstore, like they are paying rent to local people, they are buying from local people, their employees are shopping locally and have enough money to spend because they're not given poverty wages. like that dollar floats around the local community a lot more before it gets kicked out to international stock exchanges, and even more so if you spend at Black-owned businesses on average, not every single one, of course, but like on average. And so part of the question about local versus national businesses is about monopolies, is about the cost of things, is about the ways that national businesses have carved, like sort of put themselves right next to a local business and charged $3 less because they had enough money that they could do that, versus if one person takes out a loan and can't, right, they don't have access to $1 million loans from national, international investors or whatever, they can only do so much to get you to come into their store versus the Walmart or the dollar store that is a lot more affordable for folks. And like, it's, I don't know, it's, I've thought a lot about it, especially because St. Louis is less of an international city than New York City. And I think more places have closed in New York City by far than have closed in St. Louis. We've had, I mean, we all know when one closes because there aren't that many restaurants, but still, the relatives in New York say that like whole swaths of the city don't work, whereas like we're pretty good, like we can sort of support our own in a more local community where we're less reliant on other people to come in and spend their money in our restaurants.
You know, I have a take on the whole, you know, the New York and your city state kind of situation. You know, helping local businesses and supporting local businesses only works if your community is very close knit. You would only know if, say, your neighbor is starting a business if you and your neighbor are on good terms and you're friends or you're part of the same local community. But what happens in city communities is, like, to give an example, I know of people who have lived together, who've lived 2 feet apart from each other in the next flat, who for good 10-15 years and do not even know each other's name. And in the same, if you take the same situation, how are we supposed to kind of help and support local businesses if we're not even aware about local businesses, you know, existing in our community? And the thing about the word community is that it's very, it's not a word that you can. It's not a word that'll be same for everyone. For me, my community might end in the radius of my house. For my friend, it might be the whole society or the whole city. A community is not something that is defined, and that can also be a contributing factor to having not support local businesses, because you do not know firstly where these local businesses are and if they exist, and then you don't even know if they are local, you know.
Yeah, that that reminds me of how I realized that when most people talk about community, they just mean a piece of landmass that people co-inhabit. And often, you know, they may just like never talk to each other ever. So I will admit that I had a heightened awareness of how important local businesses, restaurants are when I saw them boarded up. It was like kind of horrifying, and it just I was like, you know, you can feel the deadness of certain streets or most streets now, and it's, I think, yeah, you know, you often don't appreciate things until they're gone.
Any final thoughts on this question before we move on to reflection? Cool. So I'm gonna send a link to these notes so that everyone can go ahead and look at them. And once you have your reflection, shout it out and I will write it down. Josh, if you want to, you can even take a peek at the notes and shout a reflection too. But I can go ahead and get started, and I want to try something out. So instead of like I'm gonna like reiterate on my word association. So my original one was local is unglamorous. I'm gonna change it to local is undervalued, just for so many of the reasons that we talked about, be it for small businesses. I think, like we said, the pandemic showed us just how interconnected we are and how much of a power we have to affect not only the businesses, but ultimately the lives of the people within our communities. And then also talking about how local is the future, how local communities will be self-sustaining, and how we should try more to do local experiments and how those can inform different national policies and help people on larger scales. And it's just overall helped me develop a deeper appreciation of local and community, whatever community means, as Nameeshka pointed out. That was a good call out too. Anyone can shout theirs out.
I think I want to reflect more on how much local is geographic. Like, Raven, I think it was you mentioned that your connection with local was Twitter. And I similarly, like during a protest, will look at the local Snapchat world to like see where it's moving and stuff. And I think I normally think of local as geographic, and now we have these interlaying geographies, some of which are just entirely on the internet.
I just want to touch upon like two things really quick. Firstly, internet was a very helpful thing during the pandemic because people started understanding how they can harness the power of internet and a worldwide system where there are no boundaries, there are no rules. You do you, and you see how it works with you. And I think that local businesses and like Sarah mentioned, local protests, for example, can actually be tracked using a social media platform. And I think that is, you don't have to rely on news or someone else's perspective. You can just look at people doing it and make your own perspective. And secondly, I think we have to help local communities. Governments have to help local communities and local governments using a series of decentralization methods. Decentralization basically means taking the power from the central government and putting it in the hands of the local government and communities. I think decentralization is a very good practice because it gives it is constitutionally mandatory for the government to set aside a certain sum of revenue for the local communities. And in India, we have this we have this four-tier system. We have the three-tier system. I'm sorry. We have the central government. Um, we have the state government. Under the state government, there are various other municipalities which work for cities and towns. And then we have the panchayat system. Panchayat system is basically for the rural India because that, as they say, India is not cosmopolitan. India is cosmopolitan for city folks, but not for rural India. You will find majority, about 90% of India still rural and not urban or something. And I think the fact that our government recognizes the fact that uh, we're still not that ready to have no system for our rural India is really impressive. And so a set of money is set aside for the panchayat system. And I think decentralization is a beautiful concept. And I think almost all countries in the world practice it. And the countries that don't are actually practicing it internally.
I think my reflection would have to be probably local is powerful. I definitely saw that during the pandemic, especially because it's like me and my community supporting a business can possibly, keep them in their house longer, put food on their table, can expand their business. My community going to a business's opening event, or sharing the news about maybe a sale they're having me doing that could get new customers for them. And I feel like before the pandemic, I didn't really realize a lot of these things about just how, important like local communities and like sharing was so important for some of these smaller businesses. And I think definitely after this pandemic, I realized that like I have the power, or like us as a community really have a power to like help local businesses get their feet off the ground and, stay stay a local business.
First of all, I just want to say I've been hearing about you guys since it was an idea, and it's wonderful to be here, and really impressive. I've really, really enjoyed being here. So thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. And hearing this conversation is wonderfully encouraging. How there's the honest conversation and the learning and saying, hey, you know what, I didn't think of it that way before. So that's cool, and congratulations on that, because that's not always easy to do. You guys make it look really easy. But in terms of reflecting on local, and a takeaway from here is seeing the pandemic has caused people to look local and support local, and what's going on with social justice right now and equity, and acknowledging different communities and what those communities have to offer for what their makeup is and what their interest is really a beautiful thing. And so I think that the whole concept of that we're actually the internet is really important. We wouldn't be able to be here tonight, and so much else wouldn't happen if there wasn't that overarching mechanism that makes it so that locals can connect. But there's a respect for the local community that I feel really percolating, so that we can bring more diversity to the surface and have diversity be what leads the conversation, as opposed to standardization, where standardization was such a big movement with the Industrial Revolution and post-World War II, and becoming a Leave It to Beaver family, if you guys even know what the TV show was. But having a house, having your house look exactly the same and all of that, and your food being, the same. Anyway, it's just, I really feel like we are on this cusp of having local get the respect back that it deserves. That's cool. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, I want to make sure you go, Ashley. Thank you for that, Amy. Everything you said just was 100% resonated.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think something that kind of what you said brought up kind of made me think about was how do we I don't know, how do we infuse more local pride and local and spirit into local communities? I mean, I'm from Vancouver, Washington, and literally no one says I am proud to be from Vancouver, Washington. And there's I mean, I don't know, I just feel there's, and I mean, yes, communities do not magically form. And I think that's something that kind of became clear to me, in the discussion about local businesses. Local businesses are actually huge for creating public spaces where people can gather and be able to celebrate together, right? The vibe in Walmart versus the vibe in a local coffee shop is totally different. And I feel that's, if we want to have strong local communities, we need to invest in local spaces. We need to invest in in local businesses, in the design of our neighborhoods, we need to invest in our neighbors. And so I think that's like just something I've been thinking about.
Can I jump in?
Ashley, that's so well. Sorry. I just want to riff off here. Hey, what's up, Amy? All things, right? Ashley, that was so well put, right? And I think it's so much of what we embark upon at Civics Unplugged is it starts with the confidence and mapping in oneself. So Ashley, like when you say the vibe in the local coffee shop is different than Walmart, nothing against Walmart, but like whoever opened that unique, independently owned coffee shop believed in themselves, right? And believed in their community and took it on from there on, right? So, and where someone walked into Walmart is like, hey, this exists, you have to do it this way, right? So again, nothing against it, but it's like belief in oneself. So what I keep hearing is like something that's always bothered me is I think one of the most divisive things that's ever existed is when someone drew the first map, right? Like whatever it was, a crown, pencil, paper, sand, finger, like this is what's local, this is what's national, this is what's regional, but it all roots in the self of like, if you believe in yourself, then you're proud to be from Vancouver, right? Like, and then you start to say, I'm proud because I'm proud of myself and I'm proud where I'm from, and we take it from there. So my belief is just starting with yourself, and that's community.
I know I'm a little late, but can I add a reflection in real quick?
Yeah.
A little more like a lot. So this trek is about local. Local politics is a lot more important than national politics, but it gets overseen so much that local politics turns out to be more corrupt than actual national politics. As much as the media wants to try and find corruption in national politics, local politics has a lot more corrupted, greedy, more self-centered people than what you might find in the Oval Office or the steps of Capitol Hill. When I was working on an amendment in November for bringing open primaries to Florida, we very quickly found that if you wanted to get anywhere in Florida, you had to have either friends or money. Having none of either ultimately led to the amendment's demise because our opposition had a lot more friends and a lot more money than us. And even in Florida, to get an amendment on the ballot, you need to have a certain amount of money before you can even start legally campaigning. So local politics needs major reform because everything is built on money and connections.
Yeah, Dariel, that's such a good call out. I realized that I had an assumption that the local politicians or like the state senators and representatives are like the ones who are doing it for true service because they're not going in the spotlight. And wow, you just totally blew my mind with that, because that totally makes sense. Like if they're not having an emphasis like on them, or they're not having the spotlight on them, then they would be able to, I guess, get away with more. But Amy, I want to make sure that you get in your point that you were going to say earlier. What were you going to say?
No. It was just, I wrote in the chat, like sounds like a merchandising opportunity, right? But that the merchandising around I Love Detroit, or, there's a lot of different t-shirts and things, stores that were, made in Detroit. These slogans really elevated the community long before the national attention started paying attention to what was going on. It was really, really impactful. So I said it as a, kind of like, oh yeah, it sounds like it, but it really, it works. People love it.
One more thing to add to my reflection. An example of how local politics could be less scrutinized than national politics. Here in Orlando, where I live, we have like Walt Disney World. Disney has its own city government, so it doesn't have to pay taxes to our county government, even though it's one of the biggest employers in the region, and they don't have to apply for any construction permits. So there's only 2 residents in the city. One of them is dead. His name is Walt Disney. And the other one is the CEO of Disney. And there's, it's called the Reedy Creek Improvement District. They have their own fire department, but they use our county's sheriff's office without paying anything to the county, which is very shady and jank. So having things like that, where Florida pretty much just gave them ultimate authority over a section of Florida just because they brought in jobs and money, is something very shady about Florida. And fun fact, if you actually look at the weather when you're on Walt Disney World, it won't say Orlando, Florida, it'll say Reedy Creek, because of that city government Disney had made for themselves.
Oh. Wild.
Oh my God, Disney spoils for me. Now I have a tinted image of it. Oh man.
Yeah, the
bad.
only residential address on property is Walt Disney's old office on Main Street in Magic Kingdom. And if you send something to there, it'll actually go there, but it'll get forwarded to Disney's headquarters.
Wow. It's a great example. So my reflection is that I was very inspired by this conversation. It's obvious to me that local change makers, people locally and nationally within a country, but also across countries, should be working together. And like the more countries that you're working together with on running local experiments and also national experiments, the quicker we'll figure out like good ideas. I brought up that example about digital India because I was just thinking about how horrible our ID system is in the US, and how like so many people are left behind. And I am personally intimidated by the whole like ID and passport renewal process. Not gonna lie, like I also like don't really have an official like residential address, so I can't even have like an energy bill, right, to renew my ID. Anyways, this is so great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, this is so good. Dariel, I appreciate you hopping in last minute for bringing in that like dose of realism again. That was very helpful. Realize we talked a lot about like the positives of local communities here, but it was good timing, Dariel. And
I posted the Wikipedia link about Reedy Creek in the Slack, and I'll also include it in the YouTube description.
Okay, yeah, I'll be looking at that. That's really interesting. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. We had a really great group. I guess technically three special guests and two of our fellows. So thank you all so much. I mean, do you all have any reflections, if this is your first time, on how like the format is or what you thought about the Trek overall?
I thought it was great. And your notes were right on. You're a very good note taker.
I've had lots of practice. I'm not the best speller, I will admit, but it has improved through lots of these.
That's good.
All right.
Madison's gonna get a job offer as a secretary after this.
Yes. Nameeshka, did you say?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry, am I interrupting?
No, I was just asking. Sorry.
Okay, I have a question, but it's related to what we were talking about. Am I allowed to ask it? It doesn't have to be like scripted or anything.
Sure.
Okay, so hypothetically, if we define a particular radius to be, okay, this is your community, and that is your community. Same coffee shop example. If I go to a community that is right opposite of mine, would that still be considered helping local, or would that not be considered helping local businesses?
Oh, good question. So like a more extreme example, what if like someone in New York was investing in a local business in like Sacramento, California? Is that cool?
See, like, I think at that point, it's not like supporting local, it's just like supporting a small business, which is still good, but I just don't think it's the same thing.
But what about like helping a community right opposite of yours? Like if this is my community, that is the community I'm going to and having a coffee, or like having a black coffee or something. Small help, like $1 or $2.
Depends if there's a rival football team that you're indirectly supporting.
Yeah, I don't know. I think like it's interesting. Like it all depends on like how you define local. Like because I mean, I think of local as like there's a couple of towns that are like about 10 minutes away from me. And I think I'd still consider those local, even though they're not in the exact same town. But I know some people who wouldn't. So I don't know. I think like the spirit of investing in and supporting local businesses is like supporting small businesses. So like if I go to like Chicago and I don't know, like go to like a locally owned restaurant, like or like a small business there, I think I'm like still supporting locally. And like I think it's like the difference between like supporting national versus smaller businesses, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And also kind of adding on to that, like going back to what we talked about earlier, there's a lot of definitions of what local can be, right? Beyond geography. You could be local to an issue. I guess when I think about like investing locally, I guess I think about like, do you understand like the problem, and like, do you know enough to know that you're like not causing more problems than you're solving? Yeah, and I think like your local community can change, right? Like if you move around, like if you spend enough time doing something, like it will become local to you. So I don't know, like I think about like, you know, like if that person has spent a lot of time like learning about that community, speaking with people in it, like they don't have to be like co-located to be local.
So I just wanted to, that is what I wanted to get at. What Madison said about her having quite a few towns next to her own town, is it necessary to define local, to define communities, to help local businesses and to help kind of facilitate what our goal is? Is it actually necessary to kind of tell people that, okay, listen, this is where your community ends. If you go out of this community, you're not helping your community, you're helping that community. This is where his community is, this is where your community is. Is it necessary to actually define it? Or is it something that is it something that is, you know, I assume that is my locality or that is my community?
I don't know. It depends on a lot of factors. If you're like running for mayor of a city, it helps your narrative if you actually invest in like businesses in that city and not like the nearby city, right? So it kind of depends on your objectives and like what allies you want, slash what makes you feel good, really. But I think that's we're 8 minutes past time. So Madison, you want to have any wrap up thoughts?
I mean, my wrap up thoughts are that this was a really good conversation, and I hope to see all of you again at a future trek. Like I said, we basically do these 5 times a week now, so say a date and we will have one that you can join. And have a great rest of your night. Bye.
Great weekend. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you so much.